Okay, well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's Manulife Business Success Series webinar called Anti-Racism in Work, Increasing Work Opportunities for Newcomers Through an Anti-Racist Approach. My name is Ian McLean, and I'm the President and CEO of the Greater Kitchener-Waterloo Chamber of Commerce. Before we do get started, I wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge that we do live and work on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, as we seek a renewed relationship based on the foundation of mutual understanding and respect. Today's session would not be possible without the continued support of our sponsors, and so a special thank you to our title sponsor of the Business Success Series, Manulife, and our platinum sponsor for the series, the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region. These organizations are committed to supporting our local economy and providing businesses and organizations with the resources and tools they need to thrive. I'd like to now welcome our good friend Bianca Moldovan, Corporate Social Responsibility Manager with Manulife, to say a few words. Bianca.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Ian mentioned, we are proud to sponsor the Business Success Series, bringing you insightful, timely, and inspirational topics from our local community. And with those brief words, I'll actually hand it back to you, Ian, to introduce today's speaker and very important topic.
Great. Well, thank you, Bianca, and we are really proud and thankful for the relationship we have with Manulife, who are big supporters of the Chamber and the business community here in Waterloo Region and right across the country. So thank you for your support with this Business Success Series, especially during these difficult times allowing us to access and have ability to connect with members and businesses right across Waterloo Region. So just before the session begins, I'd like to go over a few reminders. Please ensure that your microphone is muted throughout the presentation so we don't have any background noise. If you have any questions that do come up throughout the session, you can type them into the question and chat box in your control panel at any time. If you have a tech-related problem, a representative of our team will be back to you in just a few moments. And if they're here for if the questions are for today's presenter, they'll be gathered throughout the session, and I'll do my best to make sure we get those through to Evelyn following the presentation or during the presentation. All attendees will be sent a recording of today's presentation, also made available on the Greater KW Chamber website. I'd like to now introduce today's special guest, Evelyn Amponsah is currently the manager for strategy development, confronting anti-Black racism for Toronto Community Housing. She was also the senior training and development consultant at the City of Toronto in the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. And in this role, she piloted various innovative training and development initiatives to build city staff's competency in anti-Black racism. Evelyn has a wealth of experience training senior leadership, including training Mayor John Tory of Toronto and his team, and the City of Toronto's senior leadership team. Evelyn is an educator who utilizes her social work experience, education, and passion for social issues to teach about diversity, social problems, and the community development for anti-oppressive, anti-racism, trauma-informed practice. She is a visionary leader excelling in driving and supporting change, strategy formulation, and team building, and with an above average understanding of the key issues facing multiple sectors, and is renowned for the ability to lead by example, build consensus, and communicate amongst divergent interests. Evelyn has a wealth of experience training senior leadership, frontline, and supporting teams to develop a competency in applying confronting anti-Black racism lens. So please join me in welcoming Evelyn. Now, before we get started, Evelyn, thanks so much for joining us. I know you've got some introductory remarks, a couple of slides, and then we'll come back from that after you share your screen, and then you and I will have our fireside chat. So the floor is yours to get us started, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you for those remarks. And I didn't realize I sent that really, really long bio. Next time I will cut it short, but why I tend to send a long bio that sort of speaks to all of the different areas of my expertise is because I think that there is a level of, I always tell people that I've been doing this work for so long that it's really important that I demonstrate that to folks so that people feel comfortable asking me questions. Because I think one of the biggest things right now is a lot of people have a lot of questions and don't know who to direct them to. So when I come into these kind of spaces, I always say, you know, just use this time that you have with me to ask me those questions that you don't know who to ask, because I've been doing this work for such a long time that I tend to have the answers, or I can at least guide you to where you can find the answers. And so to begin with, I wanted to start off by doing a bit of a self-assessment exercise that I like to start my sessions with. And it's this chart that is called Becoming Anti-Racist. And I'm going to go through each zone really quickly, but what I want you all to do as I go through the different zones is just to think about where you are and where you would like to be. And the reason I start off the sessions this way is because I think that, you know, given the heightened attention to racism in the past year, a lot of people are thinking, you know, what can I do? And I think that's the question I get the most. What can I do, or where can I start? And I always say it's really important to do a self-assessment to see where you are, because where you are will tell you what you can do, and will also tell you and also gives you an idea of where you want to go. And so this chart starts off with the fear zone. Folks that are in the fear zone are characterized by, I deny racism as a problem, I avoid hard questions, I strive to be comfortable.
Evelyn, just one thing. Are you going to share your screen? Because we still have the Manulife screen.
Oh, I actually did do that. I'm on the next. Is it now showing? Because I'm. Oh, it's.
No, it's. I think we're still on. We've got the Manulife. There we go. Now you got it.
I pushed pause by accident there. Sorry about that. So again, I'll start over. So yes, this chart it says becoming anti-racist, and it talks about becoming anti-racist as a journey, right? And so most people start in the fear zone, go to the learning zone, and end up in the growth zone. And so in the fear zone, we have, I deny racism as a problem, I avoid hard questions, I strive to be comfortable, I talk to others who look and think like me. In the learning zone, we have, I recognize racism as a present and current problem, I seek out questions that make me uncomfortable. I understand my own privilege in ignoring racism. I educate myself about race and structural racism. I am vulnerable about my own biases and knowledge gaps. I listen to others who think and look differently than me. And in the growth zone, I identify how I may unknowingly benefit from racism. I promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. I sit with my discomfort. I speak out when I see racism in action. I educate my peers how racism harms our profession. I don't let mistakes deter me from being better. I yield positions of power to those otherwise marginalized, and I surround myself with others who think and look differently than me. And so I'm going to ask you to just take a minute, a second, to do a bit of a self-assessment. Where are you in this journey? Are you in the fear zone, learning zone, or growth zone? Are you somewhere in between the fear zone, learning zone, or somewhere in between the learning zone and the growth zone? It's a really important question to ask yourself, particularly in relation to work. Because one of the things I've noticed is, well, a lot of people will be in the learning zone or maybe even the growth zone outside of work. At work, a lot of people tend to be in the fear zone because the way that we have done work for so long has not allowed us to see how the way that we do things may impact racialized groups differently. And so maybe at work, you're still struggling with figuring out how do we ensure that the way that we do work is equitable. Maybe you're still struggling with those questions and asking yourself those questions, or maybe you're not even having those conversations at work because you don't know where to start. So you're avoiding those hard questions like the chart says. But, you know, maybe there's the opportunity to then get to the learning zone, which is like joining sessions like this that are giving you information that are helping to move along in that journey. But then the question becomes, if you're in the fear zone or the learning zone, the growth zone, how can you contribute to becoming anti-racist? What can you do from your particular vantage point in relation to this conversation? And so you see, like in the learning zone, it speaks a lot about learning and seeking out questions that make you uncomfortable, seeking out education, not ignoring your own privilege and your own access your own power may be, listening to others who think and look differently than you, and being, doing that work of learning and really getting information that allow you to get to the growth zone. And in the growth zone is that space where you can educate your peers and start changing the way that you're doing work. But regardless where you are in this zone, there's always something that you can kind of contribute to the conversation. And another thing that's important is to think about, where are your colleagues, whether it's a small business or a larger business, where are the people that you work with in relation to this chart? Is there anybody on your team that's in the growth zone, or are there any partnerships that you can form with people who are in the growth zone that will allow you to move from learning zone to growth zone? Are most people on your team in the fear zone? If so, what do you have to do to get those people into the learning zone? And so this chart I find is very useful. I think it's also very useful for having conversations with your team. So if you bring this chart into like a session and have people do a bit of a self-assessment and talk about what it looks like to be in the fear zone, learning zone, growth zone, and talk about what you can do for your company that will allow you to get to the place where you envision your company to be. So I'll just stop there, and I think I'll stop sharing my screen. And if there's any questions or comments, or we can go back and we can get into the chat.
Sure. Listen, that was helpful context, and as we were getting ready for this, you and I spoke about the fact that we're blessed to have, as I said at the beginning, folks like or companies like Manulife, who are leaders in the whole question of diversity and inclusion, and reflecting that in their own workplaces. And we're very lucky that there are larger companies that show leadership in that way. But I think the size of businesses does make a difference. And in the context of your chart there, there is a fear, I think, of how do I get started, or if I'm not doing enough, am I sort of implicitly still continuing that racism or that lack of diversity that your business might have. But the size of business, and I said this to you, and I think this for the discussion purposes, as an example, we have 1,700 members in the chamber. Probably 60% of them would have 5 to 10 employees or less, right? So most businesses are going to be that small business. And I guess we want this opportunity, and anytime we talk about this, to be a safe place to ask questions. And that's why I really appreciated that. Because ultimately what we want to take away from today, and the work that we continue to do every day to kind of get better, is to help you and the people watching, and any business or your organization, how to get started and how to get on that journey so that you're on that learning and into that growth zone, because there are practical things that everyone can do. It doesn't matter the size of your business. So I just wanted to kind of shape that, because I think that was a helpful way for us to start going through the questions here. So I guess maybe let's start at the beginning, if you will. I mean, when we say racism, what is racism? What's systemic racism? I mean, I think there's a distinction, or at least I think that's an important thing for everyone to understand, is racism versus that systemic racism.
Yeah, thanks for that. So for me, how I like to really talk to groups about this is, so racism is discrimination, coupled with the power to actually enact on that discrimination, and based off of someone's skin color, where that person is from, right? So that's racism. And then when we think about systemic racism, we're thinking about how our policies and our procedures are colorblind, right? And so I think that's the best way to kind of think about it, and the easiest way to kind of digest it, right? The way that we do work is colorblind, and what that means is, if you have a policy, let's take a really good example in terms of the lockdowns that have been happening, right? Actually, the way that the government is approaching the lockdowns, particularly allowing bigger businesses to stay open and smaller businesses to close, is not taking an equitable approach, because that kind of policy is one that's general. It's about the safety of the population, but it has a differential impact on smaller businesses that it has on bigger businesses, right? So it's important to look at a policy and think about, how is this policy going to impact somebody who looks differently than the majority of people that we serve, or somebody who might not be from Canada, or how is this policy going to impact that person differently, given their different historical background, given their different access to power, given their different access to language, right? And so something that folks, a good example that I like to share with people too is like a police reference check. A police reference check can seem like a very neutral policy, right? And oftentimes it is a very neutral policy. So it's meant to ensure that the people we're bringing into our businesses, you know, are safe, right? That's what the goal of these kinds of policies are. However, that policy can differentially impact folks who are Black and racialized, because we know that actually people who are Black and racialized will have more contact with the police, right? Police are more likely to card or have these different experiences with people who are racialized and Black. And so now if you're asking for a police reference check, that those interactions are more likely going to show up for folks who are Black and racialized. And so that's not to say they can't do the job. That's not to say that they are, you know, that they are dangerous, right? But it's to say that they've had some kind of contact with the police. We don't know what that contact might be. And in Toronto, for example, Black people are 5 times more likely to be carded, right? And we know carding is a practice where the police are stopping you arbitrarily and taking down your information. So you actually haven't done anything, but a police reference check can show this, right? So a policy that is neutral has a different impact on different people based off of what the history is and what their experiences are. And so systemic racism is that colorblind approach where we don't see how our policies impact people differently based off of where they are coming from or their race or their different identities.
And I know we didn't raise this, but I thought, I think it's a follow on to that question is, we hear in the news and you know, various talking heads talking about white privilege, right? And I think, and I guess I'd be the first one to say I've had lots of opportunity in my life. I'd like to hear from you, for everyone listening, when we say, when that term gets used, what does that mean for you, or how would you explain it in the context of this group? What is white privilege?
Yeah, great question. It's really important that we talk about that when we talk about anti-racism. And so here's how I like to talk to people about it. So if you're thinking about race as, so we know that race and racism gets enacted based off of this hierarchy, right? And this hierarchy is one that historically has placed people who have European descent on the top and other folks in between, and then Black at the bottom. So it's like a dichotomy, right? So, and what that means is that our systems privilege folks that are closer to white, right? So the closest you are to white, the more privileges you have, and the closer you are to being Black, the less privileges you have. Actually, the more the system punishes you, right? So I always talk to people about racism as a system that punishes and rewards based off of your proximity to whiteness. So historically, whiteness has been placed as, you know, when we talk about white supremacy, is that everything that is related to whiteness is better than everything that is related to everything else. And so when race was being constructed, right, historically being socially constructed, if the attribute of good was given to, for example, white people who were the people that were in power, then the opposite attribute was given to people who were not white. So if white people were good, then people who were not white were bad. If white people were smart, then people who were not white were not smart, right? So that's the way that the system is kind of constructed. And so what happens is the closer you are to whiteness, the more those attributes are you have access to those attributes. And the further you are from whiteness, the less you have access to those attributes. And what we know is those attributes have social capital. It allows you to move in the world in a way that is different than other people. And so the smarter you are, the more access you will have. And so if whiteness determines who's smart, then that means the whiter you are, the more access you will have as well. And so if we think about white privilege as a system that rewards you, the whiter you are, and I'm using white in quotations, right? But the whiter you are, the more you can perform those attributes that are associated to whiteness, the more you will have access, the more you will get rewarded from this system. And the further you are away from that, the less you will have access to the rewards of this system. And so you can think about white privilege as a result of that system, so the rewards and then the benefit and the punishments.
Okay. One of the things we wanted to cover was where do and these are some terms that may need some explanation, but walk through these. where do microaggressions or biases or unconscious bias fit into the conversation about racism? Because I think there would be a lot of people who would say, I don't think I'm consciously doing that, but those maybe explain that microaggressions, that bias or that unconscious thing that I or anyone might be doing. That's a helpful context for people to have as well.
For sure. And so when folks talk about microaggressions, they're really talking about the ways in which ideas that exist within our subconscious impact how we interact with people, right? And so if the media is always telling you that Black and racialized people like rap music, that's going to impact your subconscious, especially if you don't have meaningful relationships with those people outside of what those dominant messages are, right? And so if then you're getting these messages all the time, every time you watch a movie or you watch TV, the people that are Black and racialized are listening to a particular kind of music, that impacts your subconscious. Then when you see somebody and you want to be in conversation with them or you want to talk to them, you're like, hey, like, do you like that new Beyonce song or something like that, right? Like that's what comes to mind because that's what you know of that group of people based off of what you've heard. And so microaggressions are the things that we say and do that are grounded in these stereotypes that we know about people. And so if the things that you know about people tend to be around like stereotypes, then whenever you interact with these people, then those stereotypes are going to be the way that you interact are going to be based off of those stereotypes. So if it's like, if all I know about men is that they like sports, right? If I try to have a conversation with a man, then I'm going to probably talk to them about sports, right? But obviously not all men like sports, right? Like, I mean, yeah, all men don't like sports. You can say that. Not all men are good at sports, etc. However, if that's all I've been told, right, and I haven't had experiences with men that don't like sports, then I'm going to think, yeah, all men do like sports. And then when I talk to men, I'm going to then say, hey, did you watch that basketball game or something like that? Because I'm just trying to have a conversation, right? But that particular question is grounded in that stereotype that all men like sports. And so that's what microaggressions are. And so it's really important for us to think about when we're having conversations with people, are the questions and the things we're saying to them coming from that place of stereotypes, right? What we think we know about people, what we assume we know about people, or is it coming from actually getting to know that person and having a genuine, meaningful relationship with that person? And so really important for us to think about that piece, because in the workplace is a place where we don't really know a lot about the people that we work with, right? Like we come to work to do a job. But what happens is when you're trying to be in relationship with people, you tend to do it through the idea of microaggressions. And we often hear that microaggressions happen a lot in the workplace because people are just trying to be funny. They're just trying to be in relationship with people. But microaggressions can be very harmful for folks because it reaffirms those stereotypes, right? It cements those stereotypes and they're based on those stereotypes.
Would that follow through? I mean, I guess when you're going through a hiring process, that inherently you could have some of those pieces. Is how you ask a question as important as what the question is? I mean, is that sort of the assumptions that you have when you're asking a question of a potential candidate? Because many of us, when we're hiring, will go through 8, 10, 12 folks initially before you get to a final 3. I mean, is that some of the practical parts of saying how are you asking questions? To really kind of think through whether you're doing it with a unconscious bias in place.
Yes, and not just how you're asking that question, but how are you believing the person that's responding to that question, right? Because if you assume that I can never like sushi, right? And then you ask me a question and I'm like, well, I really do like sushi. And you're like, well, I don't really believe that. Like, because this person can't like sushi. Then it impacts how you believe the folks that you're interviewing, right? So if somebody walks into a room, I get this a lot. So I was a professor for a few years at York, at Seneca, and at Humber. And one of the things that always used to happen to me on the first day of class is students would be like, are you the professor? They would always, regardless what I was doing, I would be in the middle of teaching and I would have students ask me like, are you the professor? So there was something about me being in that particular role in that space that wasn't believable, right? And so there was always this skepticism. And so when you're interviewing folks, if there's already some unconscious biases that are existing, then when they answer your questions, you're going to maybe score them less because you're not necessarily believing their response, because you don't think it's possible for that person to be able to have had that kind of experience or to be able to speak in the way that they're speaking, et cetera, et cetera. So then you start to question that their credibility, right? Because of your biases. And that does impact the questions. And you're right, definitely how we ask questions, the assumptions we're making in terms of the kind of response we're going to get is all a part of that as well.
So how do we learn to see that race or the racism that shows up in our work, or and how it impacts those we work with? Like, what would be the things that we should be conscious of or looking for so that we can either first see it and then recognize it and make that change?
Yeah, and so again, I like using the idea of that color blindness, right? And thinking about, so, you know, engaging in a process that allows you to see that your policies or procedures or approaches are not neutral, right? I think we have to start there. They do impact people differently. Even something that can seem neutral in terms of like, how are you asking questions or the examples that you're using, right? If you give me an example that I'm not familiar with because, you know, I'm a recent immigrant, and so I'm familiar with this kind of worldview. And so let's say you're giving me an example during an interview process or something like that, and that example can seem very neutral to you because, you know, it's just an example. But if that's something that is not part of my worldview, I'm going to struggle to understand what that is. So it's important to start seeing things through a lens that lets us see the differences that exist, right? I think we have been really interested and invested in an approach that minimizes race. But in doing that, we're taking a colorblind approach, and that doesn't allow us to see how our policies and our procedures actually impact people differently. So it's almost like we're asking you to do the reverse now, which is to actually see race, right? To see race and to see people's different experiences, much in the way that we would see, you know, somebody who has accessibility issues, right? What would we need to do to make sure this person can do their best? Right, we would need to ensure that they they can read the interview questions. We would probably need to ensure that they, you know, there's an elevator or whatever kind of accessibility issues this person may have. We would try to mitigate that so that they can do their best within this process. And so being able to see what can we mitigate in terms of these different policies and approaches that will allow somebody to do their best in this process, whatever that looks like. Another example I often like to share is for a lot of people who are left-handed, they struggle a lot with doing things that right-handed people just do naturally, right? So whether it's from using scissors or a stapler or those kinds of things, like left-handed people always have to be prepared that the things that they need are not going to be around them. And so what happens is they're always thinking ahead and preparing, right? And I think we have to think about the fact that the world is constructed for people who are right-handed. So if you're right-handed, you never have to worry about getting a special stapler or getting a special, I don't know, notebook or something like that, right? I've had left-handed people even share that when they go to dinner, they have to call ahead and ask for a specific kind of table, because if it's a booth and they're sitting at the end of the booth, like they're going to struggle to eat, right? We would, as somebody who's right-handed, you would never have to think about something like that. But so left-handed people have to prepare ahead and have to be ready for anything because they will have to navigate that. But who should be thinking about that? It's the people who are right-handed who should be thinking about how do we accommodate this smaller population of people who didn't create a system that privileges right-handed people, but now the left-handed people have to navigate that. So we have to think about race in a similar kind of way, right? How can we get folks who are the dominant, that benefit most from the way that our society is set up, to start thinking about how race impacts people differently and then making those adjustments so I don't have to. When I walk into the room, you know, you have already thought of some pieces for me and we're thinking about it together, versus the onus being on me or the left-handed person to figure it out, right? To spend the extra energy or the extra time trying to sort out how to do best in this kind of situation.
So as we think about for a business or an organization listening in, or they may watch the podcast later, what are some of the biggest challenges when navigating that racism lens and trying to implement anti-racism in the workplace? Like what are the challenges for the influencers or the decision makers that are going to try and do that?
So I think for many different industries, the challenges look a little bit different. But what I would say generally is that the challenge tends to be getting staff or getting yourself to do work differently than you're used to doing work, right? And I think that when we go to work, we all fall into our patterns, right? We get used to working in a particular kind of way. And so now someone's asking you to work differently. And so it's similar to, you know, if you get a training and the training gives you some information and some tools. If you never actually practice those daily, you just fall back into the old way of doing things, right? And so in your head, you have access to all of these other tools, all of this other information, but because you're so used to doing your work in a particular kind of way, it's kind of hard to change that behavior. And so one of the things I say is really difficult is actually getting people to change that behavior through practicing daily. But if there's a gap in terms of the kind of support you have on your team, then it's hard to do that, right? Like you can't just do one training or a couple of trainings and then you go to work and then you're trying to implement it, but you're falling back into old patterns, but you don't have anybody there to actually support you day to day. And so then, you know, it's like I just fall back into old patterns. So a lot of places, a lot of organizations, businesses don't have the day-to-day support that would allow them to change that behavior or start being more cognizant of that colorblind approach. And I say how to kind of navigate that is to think about what tools can we create that we can implement daily, right? So what is it, a chart, and having a chart somewhere in the office? Well, not in the office these days because we're all kind of working from home, but is it about, you know, daily email reminders or weekly email reminders or things that you can kind of just like kind of jolt people into remembering, you know, you did this training, how are we implementing that, right? And so even if you don't have the capacity, how do you sort of develop some tools within your workplace that will allow you to have some reminders that you're trying to do work differently, is like a good direction to go.
So maybe following on in that, I mean, one of the things is a leader saying we're going to do something or make a change doesn't make change happen. It takes the leader saying or the organization saying we're going to make this change, to your point, and then what are the practical things that are going to actually achieve that? Well, one of those things is how do you know, getting staff buy-in is probably one of the most critical parts, because it starts there. With whatever change you're trying to do. What are the best ways to get staff to buy into the change that you're trying to affect?
So I think making the business is really important, right? For a lot of us, when you can make a business case, right? Why is this good business? Why is it a good business for us to do our work in this way? Is important. And so that will take some thinking on the part of the leadership to be able to make those connections, right? Is it because it's going to save us money? Is it because it's going to allow us to achieve our mandate and our mission? Is it going to give us access to more employees? Is it going to give us access to more skills? Making that business case for employees is helpful because then it's like, you know what, if I change the way that I'm doing my work in this way, it's going to make my job easier, or it's going to benefit folks in this and this and that way, and really being able to demonstrate that. So that's one way, which is making the business case. And then the other way is to incentivize or have accountability mechanisms for the change that you're trying to implement. So, you know, do we start calling anti-racism a competency that all staff need to have? Right? And so you turn it into a competency, and then you can measure it, right? Like, and getting staff to understand this is the direction we're going in. So now now this is a competency that you need, because that's going to allow us to do our work better. And then when you have your annual staff reviews or whatever else it is, you can actually measure, you know, is this person competent in this particular area or not, right? All of us have been required to become competent to WebEx, right? Or to Zoom, or to all of these virtual platforms that, you know, a year ago, we were not competent, super competent in these areas. But because the nature of work has changed in the past year, we have had to become competent in that. So imagine you make that a competency, and then you have a staff person who every day can't figure out how to use Zoom or can't figure out how to use WebEx. You're going to do something about that, right? You're going to provide them the support needed, or you're going to get rid of them. I don't know, whatever you're going to do with that staff person, but there's the understanding that it's a competency that you have to work towards, right? And I think the other thing that is useful for staff is getting them the support that they need. What I've found is that a lot of leadership tend to be tasked with making these kind of changes, and they have no idea what they're doing. But because they're in leadership, as a leader, you can't really admit you don't know what you're doing, right? The whole point of you being a leader is to lead and to know, right? Like that's your whole purpose. But if you're not providing support for the people leaders or the leaders in your organization, it's not going to work, because they're going to get frustrated, and they're like, how can somebody who's never done any work around anti-racism all of a sudden be an expert on it because it's the direction that the company is going in? That doesn't make any kind of sense. And it's actually unfair to task to do that. So it's important to show the folks in your organization that there are support systems in place for them, so that people are not afraid of making mistakes and people don't feel like they have to do it alone. They know that if they need a training or they need a resource or something like that, the company is going to be able to support them in those ways. And I found that when you're able to demonstrate those things for staff, it's easier for staff to kind of have that buy-in, because they know there's a support, and they're not going to, you're not setting them up for failure. You're actually setting them up for success through the support systems that you've created for them.
I would just, that's very helpful. After 10 months or 11 months working at home, I can tell you my staff would tell you that I still have not learned anything about technology. So they live in fear of when my daughters are not here, because that's my IT department. But I digress.
But sorry, just to add to that. So, but even if you can't do it, there's somebody who can help you with it, right? And that's important thing. Like we don't need to be able to do everything all the time, but there needs to be somebody or something there that can help us when we run into those kinds of issues, right? So you have your daughters, which is great, but imagine if you didn't, then what would you do? You would figure out another way, because you're not going to be perfect, and none of us are.
Yeah. I just want to, we've got one or two more questions. I know there's a couple that are coming on the chat box, so I'd remind anyone listening, if you do have a question, you go to the chat box and put it in there. We've got about another 10 minutes or so before we wind up. So I just would remind folks, I think I got one more question, and I've got a follow up, and then one in the chat box. So feel free to type those in, and we'll try and get to those before we end off. So building on what you just talked about, and I guess this is the last two I have, and I'll start with this one. Where's the best place to start when trying to apply an equity or those ABR lenses to policies and procedures? Because it starts with the what do you want to do, and then how are you going to do it, and then what are the tactical parts. But what's the best way to start in sort of working down that path, which I think follows the chart that you started out with, which is where are you on your journey? And we're all on a journey somewhere on that scope. But what's the best place to start for? And I'm imagining, the gift shop who's got 5 or 10 employees, or the small business. Like where are some of the practical places for them to start to really start to get at equity and that diversity and inclusion that I think everyone wants to achieve, but may not know how to do it and where to start.
So I think for companies and for organizations, one of the places to start is with your mission, mandate, strategic priorities, and some of those things, right? Taking an approach where you can look at those things and say, does it capture where we're trying to go? Because the vision is where you're trying to go as a company, right? The mission is how you get there. Your strategic planning also allows you to get there, allows you to see into the future, right? And say, this is where we want to go. So that short-term planning, that long-term planning, making sure you're doing some of those pieces, but then just looking at what is the language that we're using? Have we written a statement that communicates our commitment to diversity, to equity, to anti-racism? Because a lot of times those kinds of pieces start to get you to think about, okay, well, we wrote this statement, right, about our commitment to anti-racism. Now, how do we ensure that, that statement, the things that we're doing is in line with that particular statement? If it becomes one of your strategic priorities in terms of strategizing, and I know maybe this is like not language that small organizations or companies might be thinking about, but it is important to think about that strategizing in terms of where do you see yourself in 3 to 4 months, and then a year, and then so on and so forth, and start to incorporate language around anti-racism and diversity and equity into those places, because that's the guide, right? Like that's where you want to go, and so important to start thinking about those pieces. The other thing I would say is, like, particularly for smaller companies, is to look to nonprofits within your communities. Nonprofits tend to be leaders in this kind of work, right? And they're always willing to partner with businesses, particularly businesses that can provide local economic opportunities for their clients, right? And so if you start partnering with these organizations and saying, we can, we have 5 spots for folks who are Black and racialized that we can, support, or we can do this kind of, we can offer job opportunities to, then maybe you can sort of like do a trade and barter with these organizations where they help you with your mission statements, help you with, because they know that it benefits their clientele as well, right? So starting to think about what organizations or what nonprofit partnerships can you form that are going to allow you to meet some of those, to support you and to meet that mandate and some of those pieces. I would also say thinking about looking at a kind of like maybe quotas. Who are you targeting? Who are you reaching out to? If you're always getting the same kind of applicants, there's something about the message you're sending out that's telling other people that they don't belong at your workplace. So maybe instead, and changing that messaging is important, but it's also important to maybe reach out to some folks and say, you know what, you're the kind of people that we want to work with, that want to work with us. So please apply, right? Encouraging people that normally don't apply or normally don't come into your business by you reaching out to them because for a lot of people, if in their imaginations or in their minds, they've assumed that kind of workplace isn't for somebody who's Black or racialized, they're never going to apply, right? But if you do some of the work of connecting with some of these groups of people, targeted job fairs or whatever else it is, then you start to change that narrative, right? And then people have the confidence in your company that, you know what, if I apply here, I will actually get that job because they reached out to me. And so doing some of those targeted pieces as well is really helpful.
Well, I think that's important, and it's part of the work that certainly the Chamber's been doing for 20 years with newcomers to the community is, and one of the things we encourage is, in many cases, business just want the right person, and it's a real question of how they, I think what you're saying is if you're always going to the same place, you're going to get the same view. What they really want is the best candidate, and I think everyone recognizes that the community is changing and that we need the best talent regardless of where it comes from. But it's getting out of your own way and saying you got to stretch yourself as a business to try and look at what those other pools of candidates would look like, and so that's very helpful. There's one question that came in, and I'll just read it to you. And it says, can you speak to the importance in understanding that diversity and inclusion initiatives are not inherently anti-racist or anti-oppressive? And I guess the context of just because you call it, and I'm interpreting this, just because you say you've got a diversity and inclusion initiative doesn't actually make it so, right? Like I think, and so maybe I think that's an important one, is saying like, how do we, and maybe that what's getting at is, how do you actually know when you say, we've got a diversity and inclusion committee and we're doing such and such? How do you know that you're still heading down the right track? Like how and who would you talk to make sure you have that check-in?
So that's a great question, because I think that what the question is kind of alluding to is how we can kind of create these checklists that say, if we have this and we have this, then we're doing diversity, right? And it's not a checklist exercise. It's actually an exercise in organizational change, transformation, because you can have that one newcomer or those 2 newcomers in your organization because you have these initiatives, but does that mean they feel valued? Does that mean that they come into the workplace and they feel like their skills are valued, or are they there as a token, right? Just to say that we have this person, like, oh, look, we have this Black person, or we have this woman, or we have, because that happens a lot, right? Where folks become tokenized through these diversity and equity initiatives. And so the real measure is to get a sense of the pulse of, in terms of how are these people feeling in these spaces, right? So if I come into a workplace that is predominantly white, right, do I feel comfortable? Do I feel like I can share, my skill set? Do I feel like am I experiencing microaggressions and getting a pulse on how people are actually feeling? So I think some of the language I like to use is looking at the impact rather than the intent, right? So maybe your intention is to have a diversity initiative, but what is the impact of that diversity initiative? What are the outcomes? Is it that we have an increased representation of diversity within our organization? Do we have an increased programming that targets folks that are marginalized or vulnerable, looking at outcomes and impact versus looking at the intent. And I can't really speak to what that looks like for different places, but I think if you start looking at outcomes-based assessments versus just like the initiatives, it allows you to say, well, this is the outcome that we want. So how do we get to that outcome, right? Like, how do we do that rather than focusing on activities specifically?
Now, we're almost out of time, and I guess maybe to kind of wrap it up a little bit in a minute or so, I guess that the question is, it's always like, as you said at the beginning, it's a journey and people need to get started. Is there a place or a toolkit or a resource that you would recommend to help people get started? Because I don't think it's not just one place, but is it that chart you looked at and said, if you do that and you kind of do a couple of things, you start to have that conversation. Like, I guess that's what I would be if I'm the small business owner saying, give me the one or two things to help me get started so I can have that conversation. What do you recommend to any small business or organization that's listening in today?
So the City of Toronto has a Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit, and they also have a bunch of equity tools that folks can access. So they have like an ABR analysis tool, and what that allows, it asks, I think there's a series of 9 or so questions. So if you actually just Google Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, City of Toronto, the City of Toronto's action plan. In that action plan, I think on page like 17 or something like that, there's an analysis tool. And the analysis tool asks a series of like 9 questions about diversity, about, I think, representation, about, there's just a bunch of questions that you can also ask of your work, right? So has this initiative considered the impact that this would have on this community? So just ask a series of questions that are not coming to me right now, but that's a great tool, I think, right? And I think if you also look at the City of Toronto's action plan, the recommendations can be applied to different spaces, right? So whether it says increasing the percentage of Black and racialized people on your board, increasing program, like there's a bunch of different recommendations. I think there's like 81 recommendations, and you can look through that and say, which recommendations can we actually adopt for our organization? Because they are applicable and they are transferable in different spaces. And so I think that's a great place to actually start. And I think just doing some readings on like white privilege, and there's a bunch of reading lists that have been circulating that have been very helpful as well.
That's very helpful, and I think what we'll do is I'll ask Jenna and Saba to because that tool in the City of Toronto's that you just mentioned strikes me as being a good place for people to start, because it'll lead to some other things. Listen, thank you so much, Evelyn. I want to thank you. We're out of time for today, but I really wanted to thank you for spending time with us and sharing your expertise with us. So thank you so much for taking the time.
No problem, buddy.
And I just want to, just as we close out, I want to once again thank our title sponsor of the series, Manulife, our platinum sponsor for the series, the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region, and to today's speaker, Evelyn Amponsah. And finally, to all of you for joining us today. As a reminder, we do host a new business success series every Wednesday at 1 o'clock. Next week, you can join us for Ergonomics for Performance at Work. Especially timely these days as the guy that's sitting here with his bad backpack from sitting on Zoom calls all day. But we'll be joined by occupational therapist Jessica Vandenbush. We'll provide education for maximizing worker performance and preventing injury, which is really important, especially as most of us are working at home in a different environment. So we hope to see you then. For full details and to register, please visit greaterkwchamber.com. Please do share this series with your friends and colleagues, and do join us every Wednesday afternoon for the next edition of the Greater Kitchener Chambers Business Success Series, brought to you by Manulife. Because of it's Wednesday, it's Business Success Series. So thanks so much. Thanks, Evelyn, and everyone have a great afternoon.